Hey, if you're about to watch this video, I'm guessing that you're probably having issues with some form of fatigue. Maybe you're a little bit worried that this fatigue's been going on a little bit too long, and perhaps someone suggested to you that may have chronic fatigue syndrome. And we really start to worry about whether this chronic fatigue syndrome could be real or not, and perhaps what is the difference between chronic fatigue syndrome and just standard fatigue, because they are very, very different things. And while the name might just suggest that chronic fatigue syndrome is just nothing more than you've been tired for a long time, it is actually a lot more complicated than that. So I'm Trevor Jacuti from SpineWise, and I want to walk you through the difference between what is fatigue, the most common types of fatigue we see in the general population, versus what chronic fatigue syndrome is, so you truly understand it. And I'll give you some tips and resources at the end of this, if you watch right through, to help you through that as well and make those decisions on which are you. All right, so let's break this down to start with fatigue versus chronic fatigue. All right, so by and large, the number one form of fatigue that we see on a regular basis is what is known as postural fatigue. And this is a lack of endurance. This is the inability to stay up for a long period of time. This is what happens when we crash mid-afternoon around 3-4 o'clock in the afternoon as well, okay? So this by and large is the most common form of postural fatigue, most common form of fatigue we see. And we'll talk about what that is in just a minute. The next most common one we see would be sleep-orientated fatigue. And this is where people have this inherent need to sleep. And this is associated with things like sleep apnea and sleep deprivation. And this is just generally when people are really, really tired. This can also come from people who overtrain in sports and excessive amounts of physical activity. The other one I haven't put up in here as well is mental fatigue. And this is a really common problem, especially one thing that we see in men more than women as such. And mental fatigue is when the brain is exhausted, it just can't do anymore. This is what happens when you get to Friday afternoon, it's 7 o'clock, you've gotten home from work, you've done a 60-hour week, you're exhausted, you just want to sit down, maybe watch TV, put the footy on, something like that, and you just want to be left alone for a bit. The excessive amount of stimulation through the week, talking to people, tech use, all this kind of stuff has made your brain so tired that it just can't process anything anymore. And this is a really common form of fatigue as well. I want you to understand these are the most common forms of fatigue that affect the everyday person. This is not chronic fatigue syndrome. When we move across to chronic fatigue syndrome, it's a very different field. This is a brain-orientated fatigue, okay? And whilst it's called chronic fatigue syndrome, it's actually got a new name. It relates more to brain health, which we now know as ME. I won't go into all that right now, but this gives people a feeling that they have no batteries. They just can't get up, they can't move, they can't think. Everything is too exhausting. And the main reason, or the way we want to think about this, is we're nothing more than one massive electrical circuit. Okay, we're a huge electrical circuit. Imagine a remote control car, your mobile phone, any of these type of things that have a battery, and that battery is what powers all the mechanism and keeps it moving. This is what our brain does for us. So we have this huge electrical charge that's derived from our brain, and this electrical charge comes out through these wires, our nervous system, to the body itself in order to initiate movement and function. In people with chronic fatigue syndrome, it's like that battery source has dropped off. It's crashed, it's no longer functioning like it should. And the result of all that now is that we don't have the ability to move the way we should, okay? So let's dive into each of these a little bit more and start understanding the differences. Okay, so we'll start with postural fatigue. So postural fatigue really is an inability to maintain posture. Gravity is too heavy, gravity is too hard. I can't hold on to gravity anymore. And these are people who tend to slouch all the time. If you need to stand up for a long period, you need to stand on one leg or lean on something. If you're sitting down, you kind of need to rest, lay sideways on the couch, put your feet up. This is what we see with postural fatigue, okay? This often gives people mid-back pain. It often gives people neck pain as well, as a constant muscle contraction creates that level of achiness through those muscles. So it really is this need to put your feet up all the time. Okay, this is postural fatigue. This has much of its merits in the way we produce our energy. So we have this thing in the human body known as the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle occurs inside your cells, and this is the main way that we produce energy. We have two ways into this Krebs cycle. One is from a substance called glucose, which is derived from the carbohydrate you consume and the protein you consume. And the other way into it is via fat. And the difference between the two with them is when we start getting dependent upon this pathway here, the result of this is we start producing a substance known as a lactate or lactic acid. This starts changing our body's pH. As we start getting a change in pH, this creates issues with oxygenation of tissues and the like. And it also increases another substance or a hormone known as insulin. And the problem with insulin is a fat storage orientated hormone. It's designed to take part of the glucose and it's part of the carbohydrate and the protein that you metabolize each day from food, convert that into a stored form of energy that you can use later on. And the only way it can do that is by fat. So it's all designed to push fat into storage. And I've got a heap of videos on that. You can check out our YouTube site or our Facebook page to follow that about whether that could be you and whether you may have that problem or not. But one of the things that we see with people who have insulin issues, for instance, is that they tend to crash around 3-4 o'clock in the afternoon. They also tend to have a wider gut than they have height. So their waistline is greater than 50% of their height. So these are the things that we want to look at with this. But overall, one of the things that does happen when we have this either way is that it impedes the ability for us to use fat as an energy source. We're constantly storing it so we can't burn it. And the result of that is we tend to fatigue really, really quickly. Our endurance levels drop off. So if we need to maintain muscular contraction for a long period of time, we just can't do it. Sleep is a little bit different. The need to sleep is basically the body saying, I need to shut down for a little bit, regenerate, refresh the brain, refresh the nervous system. So this is something that depends upon the type of fatigue that you're having. So some people can have this inherent need to sleep at any given time because they're just tired. They're just literally sleepy. And this is something that we commonly see with people who are sleep deprived and just not getting enough sleep. Okay? The other thing we see with this is there are a group of people who can just fall asleep at any time. And we're not talking about narcolepsy where you just crash and fall asleep. We're talking about you sit on the couch and within minutes of sitting on the couch, you're out. This type of thing. And we've all had our grandfather or our father or someone we know or our mum who just happens to just crash and fall asleep on the couch all the time. And this is a bit of a red flag because when we get this sleeping feeling anytime, this can actually be a sign of sleep apnea. So this is something that needs to be investigated quite thoroughly. And gone are the days where we believe that the sleep apnea person is the person who's 80 kilo overweight, who sits down and does no exercise. We know that's not the case anymore. We know sleep apnea is quite common in people of even my size and fitness. So this is something that we need to be careful of in that. The third one we spoke about before is our mental fatigue. Our mental fatigue is one that is associated with overstimulation of the brain. It's almost like a hyper-arousal state. There is a little bit of a crossover between that and chronic fatigue syndrome, which we'll talk about in a sec. But the mental fatigue really comes from excessive use of our brain. And this is more tied in with stimulation. It comes from things such as excessive amount of time on tech. It comes from things such as talking too much, especially in men, too many bright lights, too much concentration, these type of things, where the brain just wants to shut off and stop the stimulation. And this is something that a lot of men need to do in the evening after they've had their day at work, where we'll basically need to go into our man shed or something similar, where we just shut down and basically deprive ourselves of sensory input to allow the brain to reboot. And sometimes you have 5 or 10 minutes of doing that after you've finished work, even sitting in a quiet area for 5 minutes on the way home, getting home, parking the car in the driveway and just sitting there for 5 minutes in silence, no radio on or anything, just sit there in silence, don't look at your phone, can be enough to reboot the brain and stop that from happening as well. So these are the big things that we see. These are the most common forms of fatigue, okay? These are not chronic fatigue syndrome. I need you to be very, very aware of that. All right, so let's keep moving through now into chronic fatigue syndrome. So chronic fatigue syndrome is a very, very different entity and we don't truly understand all the complexities of chronic fatigue syndrome. One of the things that we are starting to understand though is that it may actually have to do with a firing sequencing problem within the brain. So when you look at nerves, the way nerves work, these run off an electrical charge. So we have what's called a threshold point, where when the electrical charge reaches this point, we have activation of our new nerve impulse, okay? So we get this kind of bubbling under here. As soon as the electrical charge hits there, bang, the nerve fires off. For that to occur in the brain though, we need enough stimulation from other nerves, okay? Imagine you've got a river that's going through that's being fed by 4 other rivers. You need enough water getting to that point to spill over the dam to allow that river to flow. It's the same thing when we're looking at the brain and the way that it works. So what we may have is this nerve over here. Let me change my color here. We have this nerve over here, and this nerve, in order to fire, needs input from this part of the brain, from this part of the brain, from that part of the brain, and from that part of the brain. And they're all sending their signals into that one nerve. If all of those 4 signals hit at the exact same time, we get what's called a summation of charge. So we get 1 spike, 2 spikes, 3 spike, 4 spike. That's enough. Bang, off we go with our next neurological signal. If we have a timing problem within the brain though, so let's say that these 2 happen to arrive before those 2 do, okay, so we're out of sync, then what ends up happening with this is that we end up with this 1 up, 2 up, it drops back down, 1 up, 2 up, and drops back down, and we have no firing of that next nerve. Okay, this is one of the things that is believed to occur with this temporal discoherence, as it's called, which is a big common reason for the brain shutting down. So there's a few reasons why we can see this happen. So the first one is inflammation. So when we have neurogenic inflammation in the brain, this can be one thing that can set this process off. So the inflammation slows conduction of the nerve down and creates this sequencing problem within the brain. The second one is excessive stimulation. So we have this hyperarousal. So if we have one area of the brain, so let's say this area here, that it's excessively stimulated, it's overdriven. The result is these 2 arrive before those 2, and we have this discoherence in firing again. So excessive amounts of stimulation, it can be a trigger. It's quite funny, we see these small amounts of stimulation in the brain are really good for it. More amounts of stimulation in the brain can cause brain growth, which is great. More amounts of stimulation though create this fatigue, which shuts the brain down, okay? So no different than if you're going and training for a marathon. Yeah, a little bit of training is good for you, a little bit more might be better, a little bit more might get you injured. Okay, same type of thing with the brain. The next one we see is with the blood-brain barrier, and we'll talk about this in a second, but the blood-brain barrier is a filtration system that exists between your arteries and your nerves, and this basically allows for the brain to select what it needs and what it doesn't need. Okay, so this is another thing that can cause it. Again, another common cause of inflammation, another cause of making you feeling like your brain is fogged, like a lack of clarity, like everything is a lot of hard work, is often a sign with breaches in the blood-brain barrier. And the real final one that we want to talk about is mitochondrial dysfunction. So mitochondria are the little organelles inside your cells that produce all the energy. And if your nerves aren't producing energy, well then this is a big, big problem for your brain health. This is a bit of introduction to the difference between chronic fatigue syndrome and normal fatigue. This is a brain issue. This is not a body physiological problem. It's a very, very different situation that we're having. So let's look through some of these key ones in particular. So mitochondrial dysfunction is the first one I want to go through. So these little organelles that you can see here, these little guys that look kind of like beans, these are your mitochondria. And when we spoke the other earlier before, we spoke about our Krebs cycle function and the energy mechanisms that were happening. This Krebs cycle process is actually occurring inside these mitochondria, where they're converting this acetyl-CoA from fat and from glucose into a usable form of energy that we can then use. Really, really critical function. Not only are they responsible for producing energy, but these things, as part of their energy cycle, also produce a substance called alpha-ketoglutarate. Okay, you may have heard of this thing before, alpha-ketoglutarate. And alpha-ketoglutarate is the precursor to some of our most important neurotransmitters, the communication tools in our brain, things like glutamate, GABA, glycine, these are all derived from this alpha-ketoglutarate, which is part of our energy production in the mitochondria, part of our Krebs cycle, okay? So these mitochondria are really, really important. And these things can be knocked around and become dysfunctional. And if the mitochondria do become dysfunctional, this creates problems for us in the sense that we can no longer produce the energy we need to maintain that healthy nerve flow. Okay, and this is what we're seeing here, is we've got one nerve here communicating with the bottom of another nerve. We've got all these channels, and all these channels need to be opened and closed. These molecules need to be created and transported, and all these require energy. If we start losing mitochondrial function, we can't do that anymore, or at least not efficiently. So there's a whole lot of different reasons why we can develop mitochondrial change. So this can come from biochemical changes, especially things such as B vitamins. B1 is a real common one, B2, B5, B3. These are vitamins that are very, very commonly and are very intensely required in the process of producing energy through this Krebs cycle. Okay, so B vitamins are really important. Minerals such as magnesium are really critical. Iron is really critical as well. So these are things that we need to look at with this type of process. Our hormones can influence mitochondrial function. Testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, really critical. More importantly than them, cortisol, our main stress-orientated hormone. We won't talk about this here, but I've got a few videos on our YouTube channel talking specifically about the effects of cortisol. And I may even do an in-depth video for you next week talking about how cortisol influences all that. So stay tuned to the beginning of next month and I'll get that out for you. So you can understand the effect of cortisol on this stuff, which is huge. So hormonal and stress is a big part of it. Nutritional, so as we spoke about before, balances between glucose, protein, carbohydrate, fat, really, really, really critical. Insulin, blood sugar dysregulation, really critical for mitochondrial function and our brain health as well. When we start talking about brain health, we start talking about hormones such as serotonin, which are really critical in that process of keeping the brain calm. Another thing that is strongly affected by our glucose regulation. And I've got a video coming for you on that in a couple of months' time, next month and month after, when we talk about anxiety in depth. Finally, heavy metals. So things such as lead, mercury, aluminium, these type of things can also get into our mitochondria and shut down some of these processes. A lot of different factors really affect this type of stuff. So we start seeing that chronic fatigue syndrome already is more than just feeling a bit tired. Yeah, there's a lot of different components of what's happening. Let's move into our blood-brain barrier. So our blood-brain barrier is a very interesting thing that most people don't really know much about. And what we really have when we're looking at our nerves, we have these nerves coming from one area to another, and we have these arms that grab onto these nerves and hold them all together. And in the middle of those things, we have these things called astrocytes. And these astrocytes are responsible for providing the nutrients to the nerves and controlling. They're kind of like gatekeepers, like supervisors that help make sure that everything works the way it's meant to work. So these astrocytes are very selective about what nutrients they need. And they're very responsible in terms of making sure we get rid of the waste products without letting any of these bad guys in. Things such as infections, heavy metals, things like this. So what we really have is an artery and a nerve that sit next to each other. And we have these little channels that allow for the movement between those two. And it acts like a filtration paper. But just like filtered paper, the holes need to be small enough to not allow certain things in, but big enough to allow other things in. So if you can imagine a balloon, and you put all these little pinholes in this balloon, you've got all these tiny holes and you can't really see them. But if I blow the balloon up really hard, as we blow it up, we can see those holes get bigger and bigger and bigger. And this starts allowing the air to really leak out of the balloon very quickly. The same thing happens with our blood-brain barrier. If we have inflammation that starts existing within that blood-brain barrier, we get this stretching process that occurs. These holes open up, and as they open up, we start leaking things in and out. And for a lot of people, one of the biggest feelings they get with that is this lack of clarity, this brain fog, where you get asked, what did you have for dinner last night? And it's just this effort trying to remember what it was. You've got to turn the brain over to get the answers. And this is what we're kind of seeing with blood-brain barrier changes. So common causes of it, inflammation, as we said, is the main trigger. Infection is a big one. Food sensitivities, so people who have sensitive, especially from what we've seen, to lactose and to gluten. These seem to be the really two big ones that really do have an effect with that. We get a lot of cross-reactives with these type of things, but gluten and lactose seems to be the really big ones that affect this. But even little subtle things like EMF has been shown to, electromagnetic frequencies have also been shown to have an effect on our blood-brain barrier. All right, so let's keep going through. So what is it that you can do? So there are some really simple things that you can do to try and elicit whether you may be having chronic fatigue syndrome and an issue with this or not. There's no definitive test for chronic fatigue syndrome available out there at the moment. There's not even really a definitive questionnaire for it. It's very much based on clinical judgment and the symptom history that we see with these type of things. But here's a few things that we've found over the years working with hundreds and thousands hundreds or thousands, I should say, of chronic fatigue patients. So a few things you can do. Number one, does exercise exhaust you? Okay, so if exercise energizes you, it's more likely you're having the sleepiness type of thing from sleep deprivation, something like that. If exercise is actually exhausting you, if you have exercise intolerance, in other words, you go to do some exercise and you feel extremely sleepy afterwards, you feel tired, you can't get through the exercise, this is something that's indicative of chronic fatigue syndrome. Our blood-brain barrier. So if you're feeling brain fogged, as we spoke about before, you have this really heavy lack of clarity, this can be part of chronic fatigue syndrome. There can be other things. I don't suggest doing it without being under supervision, but you can take GABA. So there is a substance called GABA, which is an amino acid that's used to calm the brain down. The body uses it naturally. You can buy GABA. If you take anywhere between 400 to 800 milligrams of GABA, and it induces a sleepiness into you. It calms you down, it winds you down. This is actually indicative of a blood-brain barrier breach. GABA shouldn't cross the blood-brain barrier. So we have that small amount of GABA and it actually unwinds you, settles you down. Can take up to about 3 to 5 hours to do so, but if it does wind you down and make you feel sleepy, this is indicative that you may have a breach in your blood-brain barrier. Stimulation. Does stimulation make you tired? Does it break you down? So if you were to spend time in front of tech, like if you use your phone, if you use a computer screen, does it make you feel tired? Does it make you feel nauseous? Does it make you feel stressed? Does it induce brain fog? Does it drop your mental clarity down? These can also be a sign of that hyperarousal that we see with chronic fatigue syndrome patients. Sometimes even little things such as excessive amounts of noise, so multiple noises. So you get into a bar or something like that, there's people screaming and talking all the way, you leave there and you just feel exhausted from it. This can also be a sign of hyperstimulation or hyperarousal within the brain. Focus. Do you have problems maintaining attention? Okay. Now, none of these should be taken out of context. It's not just because you have an attention issue, you have chronic fatigue syndrome. We need to remember that. It's a cascade of different events, and there's a lot more to it than what I'm bringing out here. But these are just some of the key things that can help you work out whether you may have a problem or not. So focus. Do you struggle to maintain attention? Do you struggle to keep focus on a topic, or do you tend to move around all over the place? Do you find thinking exhausting? Like the concept of actually doing something, reading a book, getting away, getting outside, is the concept of even getting off the couch completely exhausting. Okay, this is something that's more indicative of chronic fatigue syndrome. And the other big thing that we see that we haven't really spoken about here too much is changes in the autonomic nervous system. So this is the regulatory system that regulates your flight or fight response, because most people with chronic fatigue syndrome are in a heightened level of flight or fight. Okay, that's pretty consistent with them. So they often have things like light sensitivity and sound sensitivity as a result of all that. They often have insomnia. They can't get to sleep even though they're really, really tired all the time. So a couple of little things that you may find. Number one, do you find that your heart rate goes skyrocketing when you stand? Is it 70 beats, 75 beats per minute when you're sitting, and then you stand up and it goes up to 110? This is one thing. Do you have low blood pressure? Is your blood pressure down, your systolic down in the low hundreds, your diastolic's even down into the 60s? And when you stand up, does that blood pressure drop even further? Okay, these are all markers of potential chronic fatigue syndrome. Most of these things, not all of them, but most of these things won't be present if you're having the normal causes of fatigue. Yes, you may have one or two isolated things. So you may struggle having attention, but exercise doesn't bother you. You may find that you have brain fog, but your heart rate doesn't change when you stand rapidly, okay? So if you have one or two, it's not such a big thing, but when you start seeing a series of all these things together, this is when you start or should start worrying about whether or not you have chronic fatigue syndrome. If you do have any questions on all this and you're unsure whether this is you or not, just reach out to me. You can always get a hold of me via our Facebook page or via our Instagram page. I am this week going to be doing a couple of videos on our Facebook page about things you can do to help yourself with chronic fatigue syndrome. So jump on our Facebook page if you do think you have chronic fatigue syndrome, and we may be able to get you some form of help and get you back on track, and maybe just even help yourself and get your life back off and running again. Anyway guys, I'm Trevor Jacuti from Spinewise. Thank you for watching this far in. If you do have questions, please reach out. The links to our social media pages are below. Always there to help. This can be a very confusing topic, chronic fatigue syndrome versus fatigue, and sometimes you do need some help to work this out, but my team is always here for you if you need us. See you next month.